Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and also thank you very much for inviting me to speak to this fantastic conference on a very important topic, and to speak about the link to this other important topic on climate change and the energy transition. So I would like to start by outlining a bit what is really the most important driver of the energy transition, what is and what needs to be the driver of the energy transition into clean energy that also has been referred to earlier a few times. And this is the need to avoid or at least limit the risks and impacts and damages caused by climate change. And that is why the international community agreed to the Paris Agreement and the long-term temperature goal to exactly limit these risks. And this, of course, is one of the examples of a global partnership that is so important to tackle this global challenge. And just to highlight why that limit, the objective to pursue to limit global warming to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels, and we are actually already at 1 degree above pre-industrial levels and are already seeing impacts across the globe. So why this limit that was agreed matters so much has been unpacked very thoroughly by the international scientific community with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a special report that was released and adopted by governments last year that shows how big how much risks increase if you go beyond the limit of 1.5, and how even just the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and 2 degrees was a limit that the international community had embraced earlier, how much this difference really matters in terms of impact, and some of them are highlighted here in the visual where you see how the frequency of extreme events related to heat waves increases, but also other risks like extreme precipitation and the sea level rise and the related risks to many livelihoods, and of course also coral reefs, which are important for not just from a biodiversity aspect, but also for livelihoods in many countries of the world, and in particular also here in the Asia-Pacific region. And the IPCC has also identified some of the regions like Southeast Asia and South Asia as hotspots for impacts, in particularly vulnerable South Asia, for example, also for extreme precipitation events and also heat waves. This limit matters, and anything, the more we go beyond it, the more people get affected, and we're talking about tens and hundreds of millions of people, more people that would get affected if we don't limit warming. And this then leads also to an economic risk, and this is what is highlighted here in the panels that show the results of how the limitation to 1.5 reduces the economic damages in terms of reduced GDP, and in particular the Asia-Pacific region and developing countries in the tropics are benefiting a lot from reducing those impacts on economic growth that come from climate change. Now, what does it mean? How do we achieve a transition that keeps that limit inside and the possibility to limit global warming to this limit? This has also been analyzed by the IPCC, and what I'm showing here is just an illustration of typical pathways. It's a median pathway of the range of pathways that have been analyzed internationally of how do we get there in terms of emission pathways. And what is important is that we need to get to net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions globally by 2070, and then achieve negative emissions thereafter to basically draw out carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, because we have already put too much into the atmosphere in the past. And it means very urgently peaking global greenhouse gas emissions and starting to reduce them very fast thereafter by something like 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. And again, reaching net zero and then negative afterwards. So this is for all greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the most important greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide that needs to be reduced, and there are opportunities to achieve negative emissions through land use or other technologies. And the most important contribution, of course, are fossil fuels and industry and CO2 emissions from these sources that need to be reduced at a similar pace with other reductions from other greenhouse gases and sectors. So carbon dioxide needs to be reduced to net zero, peaking as well, and as soon as possible, reducing by 40% by 2030 and reaching zero by 2050, and then negative thereafter. And what I wanted to highlight here is that it's really important, how do we get there? Increasingly, countries are adopting long-term zero emissions targets, and that is very important, but it also matters how we get there and that we manage this transition as fast as possible to get emissions down as fast as possible, so that we don't rely on negative emissions technologies too much, which can pose risk for sustainable development. Now, how does it look like? How do we get to this transition? This has also been studied very intensively, and I want to just highlight some of these robust strategies that have been identified and that actually are also on the way in many countries of the globe. And a key strategy to achieve this transition at the pace that is needed to limit the risks is energy efficiency across all sectors, and this implies also some technologies that also need critical materials. And the other key strategy is to have a transition of the whole energy system across all demand sectors, and investment, a very rapid shift in investments into low carbon or zero carbon technologies. And this will be driven by the decarbonization of the electricity sector. And this is something that we are already seeing, really a transformation going on with a technology revolution that has been very much also pushed by leadership from many countries, driven by climate change and the achievement of sustainable development goals. So decarbonizing the electricity sector by shifting to renewable energy will be the solution also to decarbonize other sectors and the end-use sectors, in particular transport, industry, and buildings. So electrification is a key strategy, and that then leads, of course, to the need for more renewable energy and all those technologies involved, and storage. And electrification means not just directly as like electric mobility that has been referred to a lot today, but also indirectly through the production of energy carriers such as hydrogen based on renewable energy generated electricity. If we look at what it means in terms of technology, again, decarbonizing the electricity sector is the key. And that has to happen fastest, and then that can help decarbonizing all the other sectors. And this is just an illustration of how this could look like, for example, for a region like the ASEAN with a very fast growth demand that can be covered by a huge increase in renewable energy. And the opportunities of regional cooperation have also been studied. So investing into transmission grids for renewable energy integration and for coupling this with end-use sectors, both directly through electricity or indirectly through green hydrogen as an energy carrier. And these are opportunities also for exporting electricity or green energy or energy-intensive products from Western Australia to neighbors. And finally, what does that mean for the issue that we are discussing here today for critical materials? Well, if we look at this transformation that is ongoing and that is needed and that also needs to be stepped up in terms of the pace of the transition, it means a lot of critical technologies for this transition. And this goes beyond what is often highlighted. Of course, batteries are very important, and some of the critical materials have been mentioned a lot today. But other technologies, if you look at this across the board decarbonization, are electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen, and also fuel cells. There's a range of fuel cell technologies that can help decarbonize, for example, heavy freight transport. Also many critical materials needed in these technologies. Wind turbines have been mentioned, and wind and solar are really the backbones of the future energy and electricity generation. And just as an illustration, LED lights is one of the technologies for energy efficiency, also a need for critical materials and rare earth elements. And just as an illustration of how fast the demand increase will be embracing this necessary transformation is illustrated here in terms of the growth up to 2030. And this might be even conservative if we look at pathways that are consistent with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. Then this means enhancing the pace of the transition. And that means really an explosion of some of the technologies where we're only just seeing the start of the growth. If we look at something like electrolyzers or fuel cells, and of course huge opportunities for partnerships in this region, and for looking into the needs for the critical materials across the board of all these technologies. With this, thank you very much. You can see much of the material that I've used for this presentation on our website, with reports that unpack the need for these technologies based on the Paris Agreement temperature goal and the scientific analysis behind this. Thank you very much.